My name is Robert Riverboat. I am 43 years old, and I work as a river pilot for the Mississippi River Commission, navigating commercial barges and vessels along the Mississippi River from New Orleans to Memphis, covering over 950 miles of one of America's most challenging and historically significant waterways. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, please. I've been working river navigation for 17 years, spending countless hours on the Mississippi River system, where I guide modern vessels through waters that have served as America's primary transportation corridor for over 2 centuries. This happened last November while piloting a grain barge convoy northbound from New Orleans to Vicksburg. During night navigation through a section of river between Natchez and Vicksburg, where the Mississippi follows its historical channel through some of the Delta's most atmospheric and culturally significant areas. Night navigation on the Mississippi requires constant attention to river conditions, channel markers, and other vessel traffic, but also demands awareness of the river's complex history and the countless vessels that have traveled these waters since steamboat transportation began in the early 1800s. I was piloting a convoy of 4 grain barges through a section of river that passes several abandoned plantation sites and historical steamboat landings that once served as major commercial ports during the antebellum period, when riverboat transportation connected the Delta with markets throughout the Mississippi River system. Around 10 p.m., while navigating through a bend near Grand Gulf, Mississippi, my radar equipment began showing vessel contacts that didn't correspond to any known river traffic or anchored barges in the area. The radar contacts appeared to be large vessels moving upstream at speeds consistent with steamboat navigation. But when I attempted visual confirmation and radio contact, no vessels were visible despite clear night conditions and excellent visibility. Around 11 p.m., while continuing upriver navigation, I observed something that immediately reminded me why the Mississippi River holds such powerful connections to America's transportation history and the countless people whose lives and work were defined by river travel. Approaching from downriver was what appeared to be a large steamboat, moving at typical 1800s navigation speed, complete with distinctive paddle wheel wake pattern and the tall smokestack silhouette characteristic of historic Mississippi River steamers. The steamboat appeared solid and real, not ghost-like or transparent. It was following normal river navigation procedures, maintaining proper channel position, and displaying what appeared to be appropriate running lights for night river travel. Most remarkable was that the steamboat seemed to be conducting routine commercial transportation, with deck lights suggesting passenger and cargo operations typical of the steamboat era, when river transportation connected Delta communities with markets throughout the Mississippi River system. Around midnight, the steamboat approached close enough for me to observe details that confirmed this was unlike any modern river vessel. The steamboat showed characteristics of 1800s construction and operation, with passengers and crew visible on multiple decks engaged in activities typical of historical river travel. The steamboat maintained its course upstream while occasionally blowing its whistle in patterns that suggested communication with other river traffic, following navigation protocols that were standard during the steamboat era but haven't been used for decades. Most fascinating was that the steamboat showed awareness of my modern barge convoy and maintained appropriate separation while continuing its upriver journey, treating contemporary river traffic as they would any other vessels sharing the Mississippi during active commercial navigation periods. Around 1 a.m., I observed what appeared to be multiple steamboats operating on the river simultaneously, a complete transportation network that recreated Mississippi River commerce during the peak steamboat period, when hundreds of vessels provided regular service between Delta ports and distant markets. The steamboat activity included passenger vessels, freight boats, and packet steamers that created the kind of river traffic that characterized the Mississippi during the 1800s, when steamboat transportation was essential to Delta economic and social life. Around 2 a.m., several of the steamboats passed close enough to my convoy for detailed observation. The vessels appeared to be operating with full crews and passenger complements, conducting normal river business as if steamboat transportation remained an active part of Mississippi River commerce. As dawn approached, the steamboat activity gradually faded until the river returned to normal modern commercial navigation, with only my barge convoy, and occasional towboat traffic, typical of current Mississippi River transportation. When I completed my navigation assignment and filed my river conditions report, I documented unusual radar contacts while being careful about describing phenomena that might require additional investigation by river authorities. 3 weeks later, I was contacted by Dr. Samuel River History from Tulane University, who specialized in Mississippi River transportation history and had maintained interest in steamboat encounters reported by modern river personnel. Dr. River History explained that steamboat sightings had been reported on the Mississippi River for decades, particularly in areas where major steamboat ports and transportation routes had been central to Delta commerce during the 1800s. He showed me historical accounts from river pilots and commercial navigation personnel dating back to the early 1900s, describing encounters with steamboat traffic that appeared to be continuing historical transportation patterns despite the end of commercial steamboat operations. According to Dr. River History's research, the phenomena seem to occur most frequently in sections of the Mississippi River where steamboat transportation had been most intensive and where major river ports had served as focal points for Delta economic and social activity. He also mentioned that steamboat encounters often involve vessels that appeared to be conducting specific historical routes or serving transportation needs that had been central to particular periods of Mississippi River commerce and community development. I spoke with veteran river pilots who had worked the Mississippi for decades and were familiar with the river's complex history and the role steamboat transportation had played in connecting Delta communities with broader American economic systems. Several described similar encounters with historical river traffic, emphasizing that steamboat sightings seem to represent the continuation of transportation patterns that had been essential to Mississippi River communities for generations. I continue working river navigation on the Mississippi because it is challenging professional work that connects me to one of America's most important transportation corridors. But I am much more respectful now of the historical significance of waters that have served countless travelers and communities across more than 2 centuries of river commerce. When I encounter unusual phenomena during river navigation, I approach such experiences as reminders of the deep connections between modern Mississippi River transportation and the generations of river workers whose knowledge and dedication established the navigation traditions that continue to guide contemporary river commerce. My name is Thomas Swampwater. I am 39 years old, and I work as a wildlife biologist for the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, conducting ecosystem research throughout the Louisiana bayou systems, including extensive fieldwork in Honey Island Swamp, a 70,000-acre wilderness area in southeastern Louisiana. I've been working wetland biology for 14 years, specializing in apex predator populations and ecosystem relationships in Louisiana's most remote and biodiverse swampland environments, where I document species interactions and habitat conditions. This happened last March while conducting alligator population surveys in the remote interior sections of Honey Island Swamp, about 30 miles northeast of New Orleans. In an area of pristine cypress, Tupelo swamp that supports diverse wildlife populations and remains largely unexplored except by researchers and experienced swamp guides. Honey Island Swamp is one of Louisiana's most pristine remaining swampland areas, containing old-growth cypress forests, complex waterway systems, and wildlife populations that include alligators, black bears, and numerous species that require undisturbed wetland habitat for survival. I was conducting systematic wildlife surveys using trail cameras, track documentation, and behavioral observation to assess alligator population density and territorial patterns throughout areas of the swamp that receive minimal human disturbance. The work required spending multiple days camping in the swamp interior while documenting predator-prey relationships and habitat use patterns that help guide wetland conservation and wildlife management policies throughout Louisiana's coastal ecosystems. On my 3rd day of fieldwork, while checking trail cameras positioned along game trails in a section of swamp, about 15 miles from the nearest boat access, I discovered evidence that immediately distinguished this survey from routine wildlife biology research. I found tracks in soft mud beside a cypress slough that were unlike anything in my 14 years of Louisiana wildlife experience. The tracks were roughly humanoid but much larger than human feet, with webbed toes and claw marks that suggested adaptation to both terrestrial and aquatic environments. Most remarkable was that the tracks showed evidence of bipedal locomotion combined with what appeared to be swimming or wading capabilities, suggesting a creature that was equally adapted to swamp travel through both water and land environments. The track pattern led to areas where something large had been feeding, with evidence of fish consumption, plant gathering, and what appeared to be systematic hunting that exceeded the capabilities of known Louisiana swamp wildlife. Around noon, while following the track pattern through dense cypress forest, I encountered the source of the unusual sign. Moving through the swamp about 100 yards ahead was something that appeared to be a large primate, but its size and aquatic adaptations exceeded anything that should exist in Louisiana wildlife populations. The creature was approximately 7 feet tall, covered in grayish-brown hair, and demonstrated remarkable adaptation to swamp environments, moving through waist-deep water with ease, while showing obvious intelligence and awareness of its surroundings. Through binoculars, I could observe the creature's behavior for about 30 minutes, as it moved through terrain that would challenge even experienced swamp guides. The creature showed perfect adaptation to wetland travel and sophisticated understanding of swamp ecology. Most fascinating was that the creature appeared to be conducting its own ecosystem management, selectively harvesting fish and plants in ways that suggested understanding of sustainable resource use and wetland conservation principles. Around 2 p.m., while I was documenting the creature's foraging patterns, it became aware of my presence and began moving toward my observation position with apparent curiosity rather than aggressive or defensive behavior. The creature approached to within about 50 yards of my position and seemed to be studying my research equipment and activities with obvious interest in scientific investigation methods and wildlife biology techniques. Around 3 p.m., the creature began making vocalizations that didn't match any known Louisiana wildlife. Complex sounds that seemed part primate communication and part aquatic adaptation, with acoustic characteristics suited to swamp environments. The vocalizations appeared to be directed toward my location with communicative intent, suggesting the creature was attempting to establish some form of dialogue or information exchange about swamp conditions and research activities. Most remarkable was that the creature demonstrated knowledge of swamp ecology that exceeded my scientific training, showing me fish populations and plant communities that weren't documented in official Louisiana wetland inventories. Around 4 p.m., the creature guided me to areas of the swamp that contained wildlife concentrations and ecological relationships that enhanced my understanding of Honey Island swamp, biodiversity, and conservation needs. The guidance provided insights into swamp ecosystem management that weren't available through conventional scientific methods, revealing species, interactions, and habitat relationships that contributed to more effective wildlife conservation strategies. Around 6 p.m., the creature moved away through the swamp with fluid grace that demonstrated perfect aquatic adaptation. But throughout the remainder of my survey work, I continued to find evidence of its presence and ongoing ecosystem management activities. When I completed my research and returned to Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries headquarters, I filed a detailed wildlife observation report while following established protocols for unusual species encounters that might require additional scientific investigation. 2 weeks later, I was contacted by Dr. Roy Mackle from the University of Chicago, who had conducted extensive research into the Honey Island swamp beast and maintained scientific interest in unknown species that might exist in Louisiana's most remote wetland environments. Dr. Mackle explained that similar creature encounters had been documented in Honey Island swamp since the 1960s. With consistent descriptions from wildlife biologists, swamp guides, and researchers describing a large, intelligent, semi-aquatic primate that demonstrated advanced understanding of swamp ecology. He showed me historical accounts and photographic evidence from previous investigations, describing creature behavior that matched my observations and suggested that Louisiana's most pristine swamplands might support unknown species with remarkable ecological adaptations. According to Dr. Mackel's research, the Honey Island swamp beast appeared to be a highly intelligent creature that had achieved perfect adaptation to Louisiana wetland environments, and might represent an unknown primate species that had evolved specifically for swamp survival. He also mentioned that the creature seemed to be actively involved in ecosystem management and conservation, with behavior patterns that suggested it understood the importance of maintaining biodiversity and habitat health in Louisiana's most critical wetland areas. I continue working wildlife biology throughout Louisiana's swamp systems because it is essential conservation work that protects some of North America's most important wetland ecosystems. But I am much more aware now that Louisiana swamplands might contain biodiversity that exceeds current scientific understanding. When I encounter unusual wildlife during swamp research, I maintain scientific protocols while remaining open to the possibility that Louisiana's most pristine wetland environments might support species that bridge the gap between known and unknown wildlife populations with remarkable ecological adaptations. My name is William Plantation. I am 56 years old, and I work as a historical preservation consultant specializing in antebellum architecture throughout the Mississippi Delta, where I assess and maintain plantation mansions and related structures that represent important but complex aspects of Southern history and architectural heritage. I've been working historical preservation for 28 years, spending extensive time documenting and maintaining plantation properties throughout Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, where antebellum mansions require ongoing preservation work to protect significant architectural and historical resources. This happened last October while conducting preservation assessment at Rosemont Plantation, a Greek Revival mansion built in 1856 near Woodville, Mississippi, that had been abandoned since the 1960s, but retained important architectural features requiring documentation and stabilization. Rosemont Plantation was typical of wealthy Delta plantations before the Civil War, with a main mansion, outbuildings, and extensive grounds that had supported large-scale cotton agriculture using enslaved labor during the antebellum period. The mansion had been empty for over 50 years but remained structurally sound, with original architectural details, furnishings, and decorative elements that provided important insights into antebellum plantation life and the complex social relationships that characterized the plantation system. I was conducting detailed documentation of interior conditions and architectural features while assessing preservation needs for potential restoration that would allow the mansion to serve as a historical education site, addressing the full complexity of plantation history. Around 8 p.m., while documenting architectural details in the main parlor using photography and measurement equipment, I began hearing sounds from other parts of the mansion that suggested human activity, despite the fact that the building had been abandoned for decades. The sounds included footsteps, doors opening and closing, conversations, and musical instruments. Activities consistent with the social life of a wealthy plantation mansion during its operational period in the mid-1800s. Around 9 p.m., while examining plasterwork and woodwork details in the dining room, I encountered something that challenged my understanding of historical preservation and the relationship between architectural spaces and the human activities they once contained. Moving through the mansion were figures dressed in period clothing from the 1850s, engaged in activities that recreated plantation social life during the antebellum period. Formal dinners, musical entertainment, social gatherings, and domestic activities that characterized wealthy plantation households. The figures appeared solid and real, not transparent or ghost-like. They were conducting normal mansion activities with the social protocols and cultural patterns that would have been typical of plantation society before the Civil War. Most remarkable was that the figures included both plantation family members and enslaved people, recreating the complex social relationships and power dynamics that had defined plantation life during the antebellum period. Around 10 p.m., I observed what appeared to be a complete plantation household in operation. Dozens of people engaged in activities that represented all aspects of antebellum plantation society, from elegant social gatherings to the domestic labor that supported plantation operations. The activity provided insights into the daily realities of plantation life that weren't available through architectural documentation alone, showing how the mansion spaces had been used and the social relationships that had characterized antebellum plantation communities. Around 11 p.m., several of the figures approached and seemed to be providing guidance about the mansion's history and the importance of accurate historical interpretation that addressed the full complexity of plantation society. Though no verbal communication occurred, the spiritual guidance enhanced my understanding of how plantation preservation should address both architectural significance and the historical experiences of all people who had lived and worked on antebellum plantation properties. Around midnight, I observed interactions between plantation family members and enslaved people that provided difficult but important insights into the power relationships and social dynamics that had characterized the plantation system. The interactions showed both the elegance of wealthy plantation social life and the harsh realities of enslaved labor that had supported plantation prosperity, emphasizing the importance of historical preservation that addresses the complete truth of antebellum plantation society. As dawn approached, the plantation activity gradually faded until the mansion returned to its normal abandoned condition. But the historical insights I'd gained provided crucial understanding of how plantation preservation should serve educational purposes that honor all aspects of Southern history. When I completed my preservation assessment and filed my report, I focused on architectural conditions while including recommendations for historical interpretation that would address the full complexity of plantation history and the experiences of all people who had lived on the property. I continue working plantation preservation throughout the Mississippi Delta because it is important work that protects significant architectural resources while ensuring that historical interpretation addresses the full complexity of antebellum society and its continuing impact on Southern communities. When I encounter spiritual phenomena during plantation preservation work, I approach such experiences as reminders that historical properties retain connections to all the human experiences they contained, and that effective preservation requires honoring the full truth of Southern history rather than selective commemoration of particular aspects of plantation society.